In October 1962, the world stood closer to nuclear war than ever before. For 13 tense days, humanity lived under the shadow of annihilation as two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stared each other down, each decision carrying the weight of life and death for millions. This moment in history, remembered as the Cuban Missile Crisis, was not just a standoff. It was a chilling reminder of how fragile peace can be and how quickly the world can spiral into chaos. But how did we get here? To understand, we must rewind a few years. The Cold War had already divided the globe into two camps. The capitalist West, led by Washington, and the communist East, led by Moscow. Both sides were locked in a deadly arms race, building enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over. Fear and suspicion defined the era. Each move made by one side was seen as a threat by the other. Then came Cuba. Just 90 miles from the U.S. coastline, Cuba had been taken over in 1959 by Fidel Castro's revolution. Castro ousted the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and declared a socialist state. For Washington, this was a nightmare, a communist nation in its own backyard. Tensions exploded in 1961 with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, when U.S.-trained Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro. The operation ended in disaster, humiliating President John F. Kennedy and pushing Castro straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba was a perfect answer to America's nuclear advantage. The United States had already placed missiles in Turkey and Italy, directly threatening the Soviet homeland. By secretly deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev hoped to level the playing field, protect Castro's regime, and gain a powerful bargaining chip. By the summer of 1962, Soviet ships carrying missile parts and thousands of troops crossed the Atlantic, heading for Cuba under a veil of secrecy. The plan was bold, dangerous, and incredibly risky. The Soviets believed the U.S. would never discover their operation, at least not until the weapons were ready. But in October, high above Cuban skies, an American U-2 spy plane captured shocking photographs. Hidden in the fields and jungles of Cuba were launch sites, missiles capable of reaching Washington, New York, and nearly every major American city within minutes. The discovery sent shockwaves through the White House. Kennedy now faced the greatest test of his presidency. The world was about to hold its breath. The photographs confirmed the worst fears of the American government. Nuclear missiles, stationed just off their shores, aimed directly at their cities. The discovery marked the beginning of the most dangerous standoff in modern history. President Kennedy called together his closest advisors, forming what became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. Inside the walls of the White House, voices clashed. Military leaders pressed for an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites, while others urged caution, warning that such an attack could trigger all-out war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy, caught between the hawks and the doves, searched for another path. He understood the stakes. One wrong move could mean nuclear fire raining down on both the United States and the Soviet Union, and perhaps the end of civilization itself. After tense deliberations, Kennedy announced a decision. The United States would impose a quarantine, a naval blockade around Cuba, to prevent any further Soviet weapons from arriving. It was a gamble, one that risked direct confrontation with Soviet ships already steaming toward the Caribbean. As the blockade went into effect, the world held its breath. News networks buzzed with speculation. Ordinary people lined up at grocery stores, buying supplies, fearing that nuclear war was only hours away. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills, though deep down many knew that no desk could save them from a nuclear blast. Behind the scenes, a deadly game of cat and mouse was unfolding. Soviet ships approached the blockade line, testing the American resolve. At the same time, the missile sites in Cuba were being rapidly constructed. Time was running out. Kennedy knew that once those missiles became operational, his options would shrink dramatically. What makes this story even more haunting are the details that almost slipped into history unnoticed. In those days, communication between Washington and Moscow was painfully slow. Messages sometimes took hours to be delivered and translated, leaving both leaders guessing at the other's intentions. One misinterpreted word, one false report could spark catastrophe. And then there were the U-2 spy planes. On October 27th, one American U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Military advisors urged Kennedy to strike back, but he refused, knowing that retaliation might unleash a chain reaction impossible to stop. These moments showed just how fragile peace really was, balanced on the edge of human judgment. The world was watching, waiting, wondering who would blink first. The crisis reached its breaking point, with missiles nearly operational in Cuba, an American pilot killed, and Soviet ships challenging the blockade. The stage was set for disaster. It was October 27th, later called Black Saturday, the most dangerous day in human history. In Washington, the tension was unbearable. Some of Kennedy's advisors urged immediate airstrikes, even an invasion of Cuba. Others pleaded for restraint. Across the ocean in Moscow, Khrushchev faced his own pressures. He had gambled everything on placing those missiles in Cuba, but now the gamble threatened to spiral into nuclear war neither side truly wanted. As the clock ticked, two very different messages arrived from the Kremlin. The first was a private letter from Khrushchev, emotional, almost pleading, suggesting a deal. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged never to invade the island. But before Kennedy could respond, a second, much harsher message appeared, demanding that the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The conflicting signals added confusion at the worst possible moment. Inside the White House, Kennedy and his brother Robert made a daring decision. They would publicly respond only to the first, softer letter, while secretly agreeing to the terms of the second. It was a calculated risk, one that required delicate diplomacy and immense trust. Meanwhile, the world edged closer to the unthinkable. In the waters around Cuba, a Soviet submarine, cut off from communication, believed war had already started. Its captain prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo against the American fleet. But in a moment of fate, one man, Vasili Arkhipov, refused to authorize the strike. His calm decision likely saved millions of lives and prevented global catastrophe. Finally, on October 28th, the breakthrough came. Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba. In return, Kennedy pledged not to invade the island and quietly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey in the months ahead. The crisis was over. The world exhaled. 13 days of unbearable tension had ended without a shot being fired. But the Cuban Missile Crisis left behind a permanent scar on history. It revealed the razor-thin line between peace and annihilation, and it forced both superpowers to rethink how they managed their rivalry. A direct hotline was soon established between Washington and Moscow, so that never again would miscommunication risk the fate of the planet. The world had stared into the abyss and stepped back